Lots happened yesterday. I'm in the process of setting up my whole new streaming area and all this other things. So you guys are just gonna have to deal with the typical webcam stuff. But I got a lot of other stuff planned for what things will look like in the future. But thought I'd start today with talking about kind of where the Texans are at, some of the things that are happening within the organization, and then what we should expect moving forward. Things feel a little bit different. You guys have been in my DMs talking about what things look like and how this coaching search feels different. I don't necessarily know if it feels different, but we could talk a little bit about it. There's some aspects to it. But first, I want to talk about Lovie Smith. So Lovie Smith was fired after beating the Indianapolis Colts on Sunday, and in a way that most fans probably weren't happy with. I'm not a big proponent of losing to gain the number one pick, things of that nature. I believe if you can draft, you can evaluate talent. You can evaluate talent. I understand that you can control things, trades, everything else had we had lost to the Indianapolis Colts, but I just don't see it as being that as big of a deal as most people do. Will the Colts jump to number one? I don't know. We can get into that in March, maybe end of March. There's still a lot to go through before we even get to the draft, before boards are even set. There's a lot of things that need to happen. And where we're at in the timeline, the first thing is finding a new head coach. So Lovie Smith was fired Sunday night. They were very good and quick about letting that news out and talking to Lovie and letting him know ahead of time. Usually, typically like the Friday afternoon announcement is how the Texans have moved in the past. This time around, it was definitely they wanted to get a jump start on the head coaching search. I applaud them for that, and I'm glad they did go that route. Yesterday's press conference, which we'll also get into, definitely a different feel. There was a lot of different aspects to this press conference that there hasn't been in the past, and we'll get into pieces of that. We'll talk about head coaching candidates, and then we'll talk about the offseason. I want to talk about free agency, the draft a little bit, and things of that nature. So with Lovie being gone, look, nobody expected Lovie Smith to be a future hire, right? No, he wasn't hired to be here for 5 to 7 years. He wasn't here to take the Texans to the promised lands. He was a stopgap. And, you can have a conversation of if he was a stopgap, why not keep Coley? Why bring in another head coach? There's so many different things going on out there. There's so many different things being said about what happened, what caused it. I lean towards what I've heard multiple times from different people that Cal decided to hire Lovie. That's definitely up for interpretation after yesterday and the press conference and the way Nick acted. But I still lean that way. But at the end of the day, this is a performance-based business. If Lovie Smith wanted to be more than a stopgap coach, he had an opportunity to do so by exceeding expectations. I don't think he even came close to exceeding expectations. Were the Colts that bad Sunday, or were the Texans firing on all cylinders? The offense seemed to be a lot better on Sunday than they've been all year. Where was that? Defense looked a lot better as well in a lot of different areas. Still gave up a ton of rushing yards. I didn't get to watch the entire game because in Austin they're like just not showing Texans games. But it's definitely interesting to think about, what Lovie's expectations were for this season. I can't see a world where a 64-year-old man who hasn't been considered a head coach by any other franchise over the last 5 years really thought that this was going to be his home for the next 5 to 6 years. There had to be conversations that we are not privy to with Nick and Cal, with what the expectations were, what the length of the head coaching position would be for Lovie to an extent, right? I do think that he had a chance had he really exceeded those expectations, but he never did that. There was so many different things that happened this season that were in Lovey's control. Is the roster good? No, the roster's not good. I'm not going to sit here and say the roster is good, but I do think that the roster is more talented than what we've seen over the last 18 games, right? A lot of times when it comes to the roster, if you have the right head coach, you can have a scheme that's friendly to specific players and personnel on the roster. Brian Dabble is a perfect example of what we're seeing a head coach be able to implement from a scheme perspective to get the most out of their players. Giants are in the playoffs, right? And last year they were awful. Daniel Jones had a crazy good year compared to what we've seen, enough to where he'll likely be the guy again next year, which leading into the season, there was no expectations of that. Everybody assumed that they would be moving off of Daniel Jones. I'm a big believer of coaching and scheme over personnel. Do you need stars? Yes. Do you want good players? Of course. I'm not going to say that you don't, but the right head coach with the right scheme that is friendly to its specific personnel on the roster is going to elevate and be a better product on the field. And Lovey failed to do that in so many different ways. All the respect in the world to Lovie Smith, you can't talk bad about him in a sense because his resume is a tremendous resume. He's been successful in a lot of different things, in a lot of different areas, and a lot of different franchises. The problem is when you go with a coach that is 64 years old, it kind of goes back to the old mantra of not being able to teach an old dog new tricks, right? They have their understanding, their philosophy, their scheme that they're going to stick with. And Lovey was never going to be innovative in any form or fashion. And, reports are coming out. He didn't listen to players, right? We look at what happened with Derek Stingley this year. Did we want to see him in zone? No, absolutely not. Like, is he going to have to play zone some in his career? Of course. So he needs to understand the difference between playing man and playing zone. But at the same time, you drafted a man corner who excels at playing man, and you very rarely played man. He had a good season, don't get me wrong. And I'm not in the Sauce Stingley debate. I'm not going to have that after year one of a player being in the NFL. I think that's an irresponsible conversation to have. Same with Kenyon Green. But at the end of the day, this team did not perform at all, right? Like, win-wise, which is what matters, there were so many different times in the fourth quarter where either the defense was gassed or the offense just was, terrible, I think is fair. So Lovie Smith gone, which is exactly what this franchise needed. Let's move on to the press conference yesterday. Yesterday's press conference was extremely weird. It was different. It had a different vibe, a different feel than any press conference we've probably seen within the organization, to be honest with you, whether it be the Bill O'Brien era, Kubiak era, or now. Nick looked uncomfortable. He didn't look as if he was happy about being in front of the media and hosting a press conference. I think there's a lot of different things. Cal, a lot of people get into Cal and not being a public speaker, having to read a script, things of that nature. Look, not everybody is meant to stand in front of a room full of 40, 50 reporters and just speak. It's just we all have our talents. We all have our abilities. Cal just isn't that person. I don't read into how Cal is as a public speaker and equate that to what he is as an owner. I think that's irresponsible as well. We don't know because he fumbled a couple words that means that, there's people that are out there saying, he's a drunk, whatever he may be. I think that's a far-fetched scenario. I think just he isn't a good speaker. And I'll say with that, everything that Cal has done over the last year, at least with the season, I really think he's actually stepping it up. Do I know that he's going to be a solid owner? I don't. What I do know is that 3.5, 4 years ago, his dad died. And he was kind of pushed into this position. Not that he wasn't going to take it in the first place. But I'm pretty sure he wasn't ready. He didn't have an understanding of what this entailed. While he worked with his dad and been around his dad, I think there's a lot it's very different to be the owner and see what it's like to be an owner, right? There's just so many different things that go into it, and I just don't think Cal was ready for that moment yet. I think it took some time for him to find his bearings. It's not like he inherited this perfect situation with a franchise head coach that had a true plan of where things were going. He inherited a mess with the Bill O'Brien situation, Jack Easterby, so many different aspects that you'll probably never see again, to be honest with you, when a owner passes and is giving the franchise to his son or daughter. You won't see a meddling preacher. You're not going to see a head coach / GM who literally gutted an entire roster, right? I mean, and I don't think people realize how gutted this roster actually was. I mean, this roster was there was no talent. It was deficient of talent across the board. We're talking about 3-4 drafts three drafts where there really was no talent added. I mean, the evaluation of talent through the draft, not very good. I think Titus Howard is the only player left from the Bill O'Brien era as far as drafts that has any success in this league. Cal took over a hot mess, and what he's done over the last 9 months, I'm not even going to say a year yet. I'll say 9 months because he did step in and hire Cal, or at least that's what I believe, and kind of hijack that whole situation with the Flores lawsuit. Since then, though, he's turned a corner. He's reaching out to fans. He seems to be very involved in the community aspect of things. He's listening to uniform feedback. He's definitely going through that process of changing the uniforms. To what extent, I'm not sure. I was told that, it's a long process. It's an 8-month approval through the NFL. And then, so what it looks like is right now they're going through that process. They have a board of fans that they're listening to about the uniforms logo. I don't see the logo changing, but they're going through that process now. They're going to submit it to the NFL. Once approved and finalized, we'll likely get a teaser at some point in the 2023 season, and then unveiling of the new uniforms in 2024. In that same survey, they asked season ticket holders, and then they asked just fans in general, what are they not happy with? And I think this is a very transparent approach for an organization that for the last 3 years seemed to never listen to what the fans were saying and what the opinions of the organization were. And that was one of the biggest complaints for a lot of fans, was just the fact that they seem to have no feel for what the fans felt this organization actually was. Now, we're in 2023 and there seems to be somewhat of a grasp of what fans are looking for. And I applaud Cal for doing that. That's a lot to take on. It's not every day that a business is going to take into account how the fans are feeling. So I think they understand the situation in the sense of what has happened over the last 3 years, what trust has been lost between the fan base and the city of Houston and the Houston Texans. And the fact that they're aware makes me feel a lot better about it. I don't know what to expect from Cal from a business perspective. I don't. I still think he's figuring those things out. I'm hoping, and a lot of you will probably disagree, but what can't happen is you can't hire a general manager to do his job and stand over his shoulders the entire time watching every move he makes. You have to empower the general manager to do these things. Cal has no business being a talent evaluator. Meeting with the head coach, that makes sense. Some little input about the head coach, sure. I would like for Nick Caserio to be fully in charge. If the expectation is that Nick's going to turn this around and he's on the hot seat, you have to give everything that you can to Nick to be successful. And it does sound like that's happening based on the conversation yesterday Nick had with the media and the city of Houston with the press conference. Let's get to Nick. Nick Caserio yesterday didn't look like the guy that we've seen, right? Still the same talking that he does, still the same word salad, a lot of the same answers, maybe reworded differently, same buzzwords that, he tends to use. Program. There was no Silicon Valley reference yesterday. He always gives you nothing while giving you something, but then at the end of the day, really giving you nothing in any conversation he has. And a lot of the transparency that Cal talked about with like the head coaching search and things of that nature, they said that they would be transparent about. I do wish that Nick would give us a little bit more than what he gives us. I think Nick is great. I think he's a great talent evaluator. Um, but where he comes from a culture of less is more, right? Like you can't give too much information. The Patriots they've always ran their organization that way. They're not going to give you anything at all. They want to keep everything in house, and they want to just make the decision internally. They don't want any influence. They don't want anybody to have an idea of what they're going to do. And it worked in New England. I think in this situation, it's a lot different, right? Every rebuild is different. This rebuild is going to stack it's going to be the number one rebuild probably of all time in the NFL, right? If you break down each individual instance and situation that has happened with this team over the last 2.5 years, you won't find another rebuild like this. So it's going to take time. But just the fact that he looks so nervous, he referenced about, if the head coach doesn't, see eye to eye with him, and he feels like the head coach feels like Nick should step away, that he'll do so. That was referenced a couple times. It was just a weird press conference from Nick Caserio. And in a time where I think there should be a lot of optimism, even though we fired 2 head coaches in back-to-back seasons, there's still a lot of optimism. I'll say this also. If Cal had no trust in Nick, yesterday would have been the day that Nick Caserio was let go. And the reason why I say that is with the draft capital that this team has, you make the decision to reset now. You don't make it after spending the draft capital that you acquired from the Deshaun Watson trade. You don't do it. It doesn't make sense from a business perspective. Doesn't make sense from a roster perspective. Doesn't make sense from a coaching perspective. There's so many different things that could change. You let Nick go Sunday when you let Lovie go, right? And you do a full reset. The fact that he has Nick here, I really had this sense of Nick was falling on the sword for everything that's happened over the last 2 years. And I believe that Nick really didn't have as much of a part in a lot of the things that he was falling on the sword for. The Lovie Smith hiring, I really don't believe that was Nick Caserio. We saw the head coaching candidate lists that he had last year. There was so many great head coach candidates that he interviewed. A lot of them he interviewed a couple times. Josh McCown wasn't ever his head coaching candidate. That was Jack Easterby. And then Lovie comes out of nowhere right after the Brian Flores lawsuit and is hired, right? There's just too many things that line up that say this doesn't make a lot of sense. So yeah, with Nick, I think he didn't look comfortable in any form or fashion yesterday. And maybe his seat is a little warm. But I don't buy that his seat is a little warm. And I think Cal knew and knows that this is going to take some time to rebuild. I think Nick's done everything you can as far as from a rebuild perspective goes, from a cap perspective, from a draft evaluation or a talent evaluation standpoint. Even some of the free agents, right? A lot of the complaints about Nick Caserio is he's not spending in free agency. Why would you spend in free agency knowing that your season is lost? You're not going to be a contender. It's not the time to spend in free agency. The time to spend in free agency is when you actually have a roster you're confident in being competitive. And he's hit on a couple, right? Steven Nelson's a great one. Jerry Hughes is a great one. He hit on Malik Collins last year. Green is another one. There's some pieces here that he hit on. And I think it's a good add that with the draft. This roster is a lot better than we think it is. Just needs the right coach. And also the undrafted free agents, undrafted the UDFAs. Sorry, I always forget how to frame that, but could have seen a lot more of those. That would be probably my biggest complaint. I like Jerry Hughes, but what sense does it make to have a 35-year-old Jerry Hughes starting at defensive end when you could potentially bring in a younger guy who's fighting for a roster spot and see if you can hit on a couple of those? But everything else I think Nick has done has been fine. The head coaching searches and things of that nature, it sucks. I understand the 32 jobs. Everybody is going to take it, but we've seen candidates decline interviews in the past. We've seen it. We saw it last year with D'Amico Ryans. He declined interviews. And he wasn't either ready or just didn't like the job, whatever it may be. It does happen. And I think their hands were tied with the Lovie Smith hiring. And I think they just felt like this was best for now. From an optics perspective, it's never going to look okay that you fired 2 head coaches in 2 seasons. But it kind of is what it is at this point. I'm really kind of looking forward now. All that stuff is in the past. I think we're kind of in, full stomp on the gas. We're ready to move forward. And everything that Nick said yesterday makes me think that we're at that point now to where it's time to get going. And I think that's why people feel that this head coaching search right now is a lot different than what we've seen in the past. They currently have 5 interview requests out there, all for top candidates on the market right now. Ben Johnson, Shane, the offensive coordinator for the Philadelphia Eagles, D'Amico Ryans, Jonathan Gannon, and I believe there's one more. I'm trying to think of who the other person is. Not Brian Callahan. I forgot who the other one is, but those are the 4 that I remember right now. Each one is an interesting candidate, right? And it goes exactly with how we should be looking at candidates. That age of 35 to 45, young enough to be an innovative head coach, listen to its coaching staff, not this Bill O'Brien, Lovie Smith, hey, it's my way or the highway, which it sounds like that's how Lovie was too. He took no input from the coaching staff, didn't take any input from the players. He just kind of made his own path and decisions, and that was that. As a unit, as a team, you can't win that way. Yeah, that's right. The Broncos DC, Evero. And I'm going to be honest, I don't know a lot about him. I know that the Broncos have talent on defense. I don't really know what the expectation is with him. I don't know how long he's been there. I would assume it was a year with Nathaniel Hackett. I don't know if I want anybody from that organization based on what we've seen, but everybody says he's a great coaching head coaching candidate. They seem to like his style, his energy, things of that nature. That's fine. I'm at this point, honestly, I don't really care. It doesn't matter. Don't hire a 52-year-old, a 54-year-old. I need somebody young that can come in and relate to the players, meet them where they're at. We saw it like in Miami. We've seen what can happen when you have the right head coaching candidate that meets the players where they're at. And I think that's an extremely important part of leadership, right? Okay. Thanks, Storm. Appreciate you. So I guess the DC and Denver was in LA with McVay. Very interesting. So took over for Brandon Staley when he took over the Chargers head coaching job. And that's anything from McVay. Interesting. Young guy. I would assume an Hispanic guy, which is something that would be extremely awesome to see in Houston. So yeah, with this head coaching candidates, they're going for someone who isn't really stuck in their ways, empowers their OCs and DCs, and Miami misses the playoffs. Yeah. Oh, African American. Okay. I guess I was just looking at Youngarigold. Maybe I was just looking at it differently. That's great too. I don't really care about the race. I think you guys all know that enough to know black, white, Hispanic, Asian. Look, can you coach? Can you develop players? Can you be innovative in your scheme? Are you willing to update things that need to be updated? Are you willing to make the necessary changes? Those are the things that I'm looking for. Are especially from an X's and O's perspective. There's just not. We need new. We need fresh. We need somebody who can come in and just really lead the charge. And so where I was going with Mike McDaniels was, for the last 3 years we've seen Tua not be able to develop in a way that was kind of expected, right? On top of that, the entire organization dumped him to the left. They were heavily involved in the Deshaun Watson trade scenarios. Tua couldn't stay on the field. There was a lot of talk about the lack of development. And really what it came down to was the fact that Brian Flores and that coaching staff was not able to meet Tua where he was and rebuild his confidence in a way that was needed. Mike McDaniels came in and was able to do that immediately. And through week 8, Tua was a MVP candidate. Things have dropped off since, but Mike's gotten the most out of Tua that anybody else has. And those are the types of head coaches that this team needs, especially with the lack of talent on the roster. Sure, we're going to add a ton in the draft, but we need someone that could come in and really revamp this entire vibe at NRG Stadium. And I think it's interesting to see. And yeah, Peterson did it too with the Jags. I mean, a little different in the sense of like Lawrence is that talented to where, like, are you really meeting him to where he needs to be? But you're right. I mean, he technically did. But Trevor Lawrence is kind of like that guy in the sense of from a talent perspective. Tua came into the league not really that guy. He came in question marks about arm, his size, frame, things of that nature. Trevor kind of came in and was already kind of handed the crown. And a lot of it had to do with what he put on film in college. But you're right to an extent. Peterson did meet Trevor Lawrence where he was and was able to get the most out of him. I'm not saying that in the sense of Davis Mills, so don't misconstrue any of what I'm saying. I'm not saying a head coach. I'm expecting a head coach to come in here, meet Davis Mills where he's at, and all that. The team's going to take a quarterback. It's just the way that this league is driven. And whoever that quarterback is, I don't believe it's Bryce Young. We'll get to that part later. Yeah, and you're right. But the Jags they flipped everything. They did everything that they're supposed to do, and good for the Jags. So when we look at these head coach candidates, Jonathan Gannon, honestly, in my opinion, unless another candidate comes in and blows this interview process away, I do believe Jonathan Gannon is going to be the head coach of the Houston Texans. I think he is Nick Caserio as a head coach, the way he speaks. Very analytical as far as from a mindset perspective and how he views things, how he thinks, very process oriented. He just has that same mantra that Nick Caserio has. There's no emotion involved with anything. It's very much just data. This spreadsheet tells me this, blah, 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 which to an extent is great. I don't really care how they speak to the media, how they talk, as long as the product on the field is competitive and winning. I think that's something that people tend to overlook a lot with this organization is we haven't won in so long that I don't care how they are in press conferences, any of that stuff. I really don't care. What I care about is them coming in, developing talent, and putting together a consistent product on the field that is going to be competitive. That's it. I don't read it too much into anything else. I don't know if Jonathan Gannon is that guy. But it's kind of like the draft. None of us really know what this next head coach is going to do and how successful they will be. It's a shot in the dark. It's anytime you hire anybody, it's a shot in the dark. You don't know what you're getting. You're hoping you're getting the right candidate, but you never know. But Jonathan Gannon would be interesting. He could put together from what I'm reading and seeing, he could put together a pretty amazing coaching staff with Frank Reich potentially as offensive coordinator, Mike Zimmer as defensive coordinator. I'm a little weary of those types of hires at the coordinator positions, both former head coaches. We've seen it work in the past, and I'm not saying that it won't. It works right now in Buffalo with Leslie Frazier as DC. It happens a lot throughout the league. Mike Zimmer doesn't really strike me as, some of the stuff that we heard coming out of Minnesota after Zimmer was gone. Not really a culture guy, very much an old school mentality head coach, but very talented, very good with defense. Frank Reich, I'm not too worried about Frank Reich. I think he would be a pretty good hire at offensive coordinator. I think he kind of got the bad end of the stick, in my opinion, in Indianapolis. I think working for Jim Irsay is hard. I think Chris Ballard didn't really do the best job to set up Frank for success either. Frank Reich would be a very good offensive coordinator to add to this team. I think there's other aspects to this too. The quarterback's coach in Philadelphia could potentially come over as OC. Depending on how this whole head coaching search or how the head coaching hiring goes for the rest of these franchises around the league, Carolina, Arizona, there's going to be options for a lot of these guys, but Jonathan Gannon seems to be the top of the list. And I think it's fair. I think that's fair given what we've seen in the past. All right, let's get to the hometown hero, D'Amico Ryans, because I'm going to be honest here. I have a little bit of a different feeling than most people about D'Amico. I don't know if that's the candidate that we're thinking it is, in a sense. I love D'Amico Ryans. He's probably one of my favorite Texans all time. And it's very similar to the Saleh aspect of things. And I know we've seen Saleh have success in New York with the Jets. But there's just so much talent on that San Francisco defense. It's really hard to gauge what influence D'Amico has had. Now, from a scheme perspective, he looks like he's flexible and adjusts when necessary. Those are the types of things you want in a head coach. Somebody who's not set in their ways and is able to make the adjustments needed, secondary, halftime adjustments, things of that nature. But D'Amico, for me, it just seems like more of a story for Texans fans. That homecoming story. We watched him play. Now we're going to watch him coach. And there's nothing wrong with that. I guess my sentiment on it is I just don't want him here for that reason. I want him here because Nick and Cal believe that he's the best coaching candidate for this job, and he's going to do what we need to do. I'm also not a big fan of bringing in a defensive-minded head coach. This team lacks on offense, has lacked in offense for a while. If you're going to draft a quarterback, I don't like this sense. I don't like the idea of bringing in a defensive head coach to draft a quarterback. It can work. I'd rather have a offensive-minded head coach who drafts a quarterback and is fully invested in the quarterback to develop them and help them reach where they need to reach, right? That developmental aspect of a rookie quarterback is an important path. There needs to be a plan in place, and it needs to be fully implemented, and they need to do what they can to best support him. I don't know if a defensive-minded head coach is going to be able to do that. But D'Amico, he looks to be to play the part. I don't know. There's something about it that just doesn't feel right to me. And how long has he been in the DC? I think he's been in the DC for 2 years. I'd really like to see a little bit more. I know he was a linebackers coach. There's a lot of other parts of his resume. It's just there's something there that bothers me, and I don't know what it is. But I think he's an extremely talented guy. I love D'Amico as a person. He's very rah-rah. I'm all about everything about D'Amico. It's just there's something I can't put my finger on that I'm a little weary about. So yeah. All right. Now, Ben Johnson, offensive coordinator in Detroit. Jared Goff had a career year, which if you go back to when Jared Goff was traded to the Lions for Matthew Stafford, and obviously they sent more picks. If you look around and you go back, not one person thought that Jared Goff, one, was going to work. Two, nobody mentioned that Jared Goff could potentially have a record year after leaving McVay. And that's a part of the story for me that is really probably the most intriguing part. McVay is a great head coach who is able to get the most out of his players. The fact that Ben Johnson was able to get more out of Jared Goff than what Sean McVay did on, I don't know, I would say a less talented roster. To an extent, I would say this year, towards the end of the season, getting Williams back and things of that nature, I would say that maybe the Lions were on par or a little bit better than the Rams from an offensive weapon perspective. But either way, nobody expected Jared Goff to be able to exceed what he did with the Rams and with Sean McVay. That part to me is an extremely interesting part about the sell of Ben Johnson to the Texans as a head coaching candidate. I don't think it can be overstated enough. Now, let's also take the other parts of this that involve him as a head coaching candidate. Part of I would say a rebuild, but not like this, not the typical rebuild, right? Not gutted with no players, didn't have a quarterback, things of that nature. That's definitely not the case. The team wasn't what the team should have been. But the culture that Dan Campbell brought to Detroit, I think that same culture is needed so badly in Houston. I honestly, that exact culture, everything about Dan Campbell. I'll take the goofy press conferences. I'll take everything else about it. Will it last? I don't know. I really don't. But what I do know is right now, with where this team is, that's the type of energy and vibe that NRG Stadium needs. That's what that locker room needs. They need a guy that's going to come in and make this an enjoyable process. And I think Ben Johnson played an extremely huge part in that with Dan Campbell, and I'm sure the other coaches as well. And I would love to see him take all of that and mimic it here as well. Honestly, I think it would be a great thing for Nick to consider. Nick's not a rah-rah guy. Nick's never been a rah-rah guy. Analytically minded, general manager. But I'm really hoping that he steps out of that a little bit because we need some of that. We need something that changes the entire vibe of this entire franchise right now. And I think Ben Johnson is the top candidate as far as from a coaching perspective. I don't think it's the top candidate for Nick or Cal, but I do think that he's the top candidate, probably the top candidate in the market right now. He's going to be sought after. And you're right. Buying high in Detroit, scary times we live in. You're right. But it doesn't take, seeing what they've done, you got to give it credit. You have to look at what they've done and say, this is great. I like Ben Johnson. I think that he would be the ideal candidate. He'd be the guy I go after. But I don't think he'll end up being the candidate. I'm pretty sure it's going to be Jonathan Gannon. And then the other guy is Eagles offensive coordinator Shane Steichen. Look, another good story, another good resume. We've seen what he's done with Jalen Hurts. It wasn't long ago that nobody thought Jalen Hurts was even a franchise quarterback. And what Jalen Hurts has done it's honestly pretty crazy to think about where he's come from his first 2 years in the league. I mean, I think he was benched 2 or 3 times in his second season with the Eagles, and he continued to develop, and the organization continued to believe in him and got him to a point to where he was an MVP candidate before he got hurt. The Eagles just clinched the number 1 seed in the NFC. They're doing things really well, and they're another culture team. They're a team that has come in and really changed the culture. It's fun to play there. You have to watch with it's fun to play there stuff, because sometimes accountability slips because you're looking at how enjoyable this can be, and you tend to miss things. I say that from speaking from experience at other companies that I've worked at where it is that way. And I know the NFL is different, but really culture and business they're very similar at other companies as they are at in the NFL. But I really like what Shane has done with the Eagles. I think he'd be a decent hire. Honestly, with me, I would love to just see an offensive-minded head coach. Am I missing anybody else? If anybody in the chat. So we have the OC from the Eagles, Ben Johnson from the Lions, Jonathan Gannon, D'Amico Ryans. I believe those are the only 4 that they put in an interview request for. Anybody else, feel free to add that. Take 2 seconds. Did they put in an interview request for Mike Kafka? Did that actually happen? I'm going to look that up right now because that's interesting. I don't see that anywhere. But if you say so. Oh, okay. I was going to say that would be an interesting thing to see. Kafka's interesting. Anybody from the Shanahan tree, or the Andy Reid tree, or the McVay tree, or I'd probably say those are the 3 right now. Okay, cool. So those are the head coaching candidates. Like I said, Ben Johnson is He's the top candidate for me. I think he brings everything you need right now. And I think it'd be interesting. The Sean Payton stuff, I'm not interested. I'm not interested in a guy who left his team the way that he did. I can't, I don't want an old guy. I don't want a retread. The only retread I would be somewhat interested in would be Jim Harbaugh. And that's really, like, I already know that Jim Harbaugh is a 4 to 5 year head coach, and that's going to be it. It's going to wear out. Will he be fun? Will the team be competitive? Absolutely. There's no reason to say that wouldn't be the case. They did it in San Francisco with a very similar situation as far as from a talent perspective. And Jim got the most out of him, got the most out of Alex Smith. I wouldn't be opposed to Jim Harbaugh. I'm totally opposed to Sean Payton. I'm not a big Sean Payton fan. I think he's a good head coach. I don't want an old head coach. I also don't want to have to trade assets to hire another head coach. I think that would be a waste. Shane Walden, the offensive coordinator from Seattle, would be interesting too. Yeah, maybe to an extent. Wasn't this his first season as the OC or no? I don't know. I don't know enough about Shane. I know what the Seahawks did this season. I know what he did with Geno. I don't really care, to be honest with you, who the head coach is, as long as they get it right. But Sean Payton is a no for me. I'm not trading a first-round pick for a head coach. I don't think that you need to do that in this modern NFL. I think you can find candidates that are able to do it. You're right. Jim Harbaugh did have a half-decent quarterback, but you have the number 2 pick in the draft. I think there's going to be a lot of movement with quarterbacks in the offseason. I think there'll be names available that haven't been available. I think there's some things that are going. But yeah. All right. So now on to kind of the other parts of the press conference that I took away that I think are going to really very telling for what to expect in the offseason. In the past, we haven't seen Nick spend in free agency. A lot of what he's done is really clearing that cap and doing a cap reset. Yesterday, he kept talking about he's willing to do anything and everything he can, that he's going to start listening to the other voices in the room and lean on resources and analytics a little bit more. He's going to take a different approach. And that is, basically he's going to do anything possible to turn this thing around. I do think that I do think that they're going to spend a free agency. I think they're going to be aggressive. I don't know if we're talking aggressive like Christian Kirk with the Jags type of aggressive. I still think there's going to be Nick will always look for value because that's who he is. He's a value guy. But I think we'll see a little bit more of an aggressive approach when it comes to the risk he's willing to take based on the value he's getting, which is great. I don't want is Nick to go all in to the extent of we find ourselves in bad situations 2 to 3 years down the road. But I wouldn't mind a couple of risks in free agency. And I do think that he's going to address a lot of the issues that this team has in free agency. And, we haven't seen that before from Nick yet. So that's going to be a pretty significant change. I think there's going to be some pretty good talent depending on the head coach, right? Like, we're going to have to understand, like, we'll know that in 2 to 3 weeks who the head coach is. Maybe not, depending on, where interviews go and where teams go in the playoffs. And the availability, but I would assume we'll know in 2 to 3 weeks. We should know before the Super Bowl, which is February 12th. So within 4 weeks, we'll have an idea who the head coach is. But I think that piece is super, super, super important. You have to understand the schemes and the coaching staff and the head coaches to really understand where you're going to go in free agency and where you're going to go in the draft. And I think that is a big piece. So like when I was on Twitter the other day talking about like, hey, everybody's saying the Colts are going to trade for this guy and they're going to jump us and go to the Bears. And there's so many things that need to happen before we get to the draft. I mean, so many things, right? Like you have to have your coaching staff in place, right? To understand what type of defense and what type of offense and player skill sets that they look for and traits. And there's so many different things that you need to understand about this coaching staff to know what type of players to go get. The Indianapolis Colts are in the same position. I just don't I get it. It's fun, I guess. Like it's fun but is it fun or is it just like pouring you're just pouring bleach on people because they're already mad that the Texans didn't get the first pick overall. And I think it's lazy, to be honest with you. But I expect nothing less from the people that I saw that from. They drive engagements. But at the end of the day, that has to be in place before they can do anything. So then you have free agency, which is where you're going to fill a lot of holes. Depending on your approach, you can fill quite a bit of holes. Depending on the free agents that are available, you can add a lot of talent to this roster. And Nick's been pretty good as far as from a talent evaluation standpoint, outside of the draft, also in free agency, right? He's seen, the Steven Nelsons of the world come in, and Steven Nelson had a tremendous year at corner. I think he had his best year at corner. Jerry Hughes was really good. Like I said, Green was really good. Malik Collins has been really good. So he's definitely hit on a couple of these pieces. Feel free if I'm missing anybody else to add those. But I think it's going to be interesting to see what they do in free agency, because that's really going to dictate where they go in the draft to an extent, right? I know we're penciled in to take a quarterback. I'm not necessarily opposed to taking a quarterback. What I am opposed to doing is taking a quarterback because you need a quarterback. And I think a lot of times, when I talk about Bryce Young on Twitter, a lot of people get upset because they think I'm just a Bryce Young hater. It's not that I'm a Bryce Young hater. I do have concerns, but it really comes down to the fact that I want Nick to love the quarterback as a player when he's evaluating, to say that that's the quarterback he's going to take. And that's it. That's like, a lot of you guys rely on, no, I view like Bryce Young is the greatest. I understand that. I take the emotional aspect out of it. I'm not attached to a specific quarterback. I just want the right guy. I want the guy that the organization believes, the coaching staff believes, the general manager believes, Cal believes is going to be that guy. That's what I want. And if I look at how Nick looks at quarterback, I find it extremely hard to believe that a 5'10", 190-pound quarterback is going to be a quarterback that Nick Caserio falls in love with. It has nothing to do with Bryce Young's talent. He is talented. I do have some arm strength concerns, but I think he can overcome that. The size aspect of things is just an interesting look at Tua. He's getting rocked on a week-to-week basis. How many concussions has Tua had? He's just a little guy, and he's bigger than Bryce. So I say that to say, if Nick loves Bryce Young, take Bryce Young. I have no problem with it. But don't take a quarterback because you feel like you have to. When organizations do that, they're setting themselves up for failure. If you're not believing in the prospect, if you're not believing in the talent, and you're not believing that you can develop that quarterback to be, I don't know, top 7, top 10, right? If you look at the AFC, you're going to have to be better than Herbert. You're going to have to be better than Lawrence. You're going to have to be better than Lamar Jackson. You're going to have to be better than Josh Allen. You're going to have to be Patrick Mahomes. You have to. If you want to go to where you want to be, you're going to have to be better than those 5 guys. There's probably not somebody that's better than Patrick Mahomes. You also look at what Patrick Mahomes has around him, and not even from a player perspective, just from a coaching perspective, and Andy Reid and his scheme and his ability to call plays and see things differently. Add that to the talent of Patrick Mahomes, and honestly, you're not going to be able to compete with Patrick Mahomes on a peer-to-peer level from a quarterback to quarterback. You're likely not going to outduel him on your own, but you can with the right coaching staff, with the right players. It becomes a team effort at that point. I guess what I'm saying is, though, from a talent perspective, you're going to have to be on the level of Herbert, Allen, Jackson, Lawrence to get to where this organization wants to go. I don't believe Bryce Young is that talented. I believe he's super talented. I don't know if he's going to reach those levels. I don't know if any of these guys will. And that's, that kind of goes back to the draft. Nobody knows what these guys are going to be. It's a crapshoot either way. But are you really willing to hitch that to a 5'10", 190-pound quarterback? I don't know. That you're asking a general manager to take a a pretty significant risk if that's the approach you're taking. And ultimately, that's what it comes down to for me. So a lot of people talk about the Bears trading back because people are going to be enamored with Bryce Young as a quarterback. I honestly don't believe that to be true. I understand, and I reference how I don't like Sean Payton as a head coach for this team. When he was on Colin Cowherd talking about prototyping and stop taking the smaller players and quarterbacks. I do believe that a lot of teams do have prototypes when it comes to these things, and maybe not to the extent that Sean was talking about, but there are a lot of times when it comes to specific positions, there's like a build, right? It's like a build your player on Madden or NBA 2K3 or whatever it may be, where you can, this is their ideal candidate at this position. And I believe that Nick comes from a philosophy that we do have a prototype. Maybe he'll go away from it, but I don't know if he'll go that far away from it. I don't know if a lot of teams are going to go that far away from it. And you also got to keep in mind, we're so early in draft season. There's going to be so much talk about all the other guys. There's going to be a quarterback, likely Will Levy, who's going to come out of nowhere because it happens every single season, it seems like. A quarterback that nobody's talking about that comes out of nowhere and all of a sudden he's the number 1 or 2 ranked quarterback and nobody even thought about it. I think Carson Wentz comes to mind. Blaine Gabbert comes to mind. Blaine Gabbert, yep. Blake Bortles. Like we've seen it year over year over year over year. And it's going to be interesting to see where this goes because we're still in January. While it is draft season to an extent for us, really we won't see stuff like that until February once the Super Bowl ends, and we'll have 2 months to get into the draft. I think there's a lot of time still for us to really see what happens and what goes on, but I can't see a team risking it for Bryce Young. And I understand that's a shitty thing to say, and I don't mean it. It's nothing personal against Bryce Young. He seems like a great guy too. 5'10" is just an interesting size, and 6 foot at 190 is an interesting size, right? Like when you look at the frame of an individual, a lot of people are like, "Oh, add 20 pounds." You can do that, but what are you taking away from him from an athletic perspective? Not only that, his frame doesn't look like it's going to support a ton of weight either. He's just a small individual. Like if you look at him compared to Kyler's bulky. Bryce is not bulky. Same with Russell. Same with Tua. So it's really going to be interesting to see. There's going to be a lot of storylines. I think first things first on the checklist. Let's hire the right head coach. Let's get the right head coach in here. Let's hope that him and Nick align and kind of see where things go. But lots of exciting things for Texans fans, and let's just hope that this time things are right. Things are done right. They're on the right path, and they continue to build and they continue to develop in a way that we can start to see some competitive football and meaningful football happen in Houston, because everybody's at the point now to where I think it's either that or, we'll watch it whenever we can. It's not going to be, the fan base is definitely, I don't want to say dying, but they're definitely losing interest at an all-time level. And, when you have a winning organization like the Astros in the city understands what it feels like. They know what winning feels like. They want to experience that feeling as often as possible. We're likely not going to turn into the Patriots of the 2000s, but being competitive and going down the right path and winning some playoff games and potentially, AFC championships and, maybe a Super Bowl, who knows? All that stuff is going to really, really re-energize the city, a city that has become accustomed to winning now because of what the Astros have done since 2017. We have had a sample of what it tastes like. We need to see what that tastes like as a Texans fans. And it looks like they're doing everything they can. Hopefully that's the truth. Hopefully they really are. Hopefully we start to see this turn into what matters, which is wins. And we'll go from there. So, all right. Comments. Sorry, guys. When you're all by yourself, it's a little different. Do you think Bryce Young is a valuable pick because that is who they got us drafting? I don't know. I mean, I think taking Bryce Young is fine if you take him at 11, 12, maybe if you take him at 12 with the Browns pick, I could see that. I don't know if I want to take him before then, but we'll have to see. What about Jim Caldwell? Yeah, I mean, Jim Caldwell is a good candidate, but he's just older. I kind of want to go away from that. I really want just a young candidate. Bryce Young is a system quarterback. He ain't no Deshaun Watson. I don't really care if he's Deshaun Watson or not. Mills did take Mahomes to OT, which is interesting. Definitely caught me off guard. Maybe Peyton makes a winning franchise. I'm not sure. Levy and Richardson. Levy's got the arm talent. So does Richardson. I know Richardson's a very raw product from a quarterback perspective. 6'4", 235, likely to run like a 4.42, 4.45, has a hell of an arm. He's kind of tagged as the Josh Allen prospect of this draft. I don't know. I love Anthony Richardson. I'm pretty sure anybody in the stream knows that. I think he would be the quarterback I would go after. I just don't know if he's the right quarterback prospect for this team. This team needs somebody that can come in and start day one and have the city behind. I think Anthony Richardson's a hard sell to the fan base because he's not going to be ready to go week one. He's going to have to sit for a year. Who's he going to sit behind? You can't throw Mills out there for another year because you just can't. I think he would be a great pick, but I don't know where you can pick him and it be comfortable. Like, here's one thing. The athletic ability of Anthony Richardson from just an athletic perspective, he's going to be a first-round quarterback. It's just the way the league works. Where in the first round, I don't know. It might be a luxury pick. You might see a team like, I don't know, name a team that has a quarterback. Drawing a blank here, but maybe Detroit with their second pick in the first round to sit behind Jared Goff. There's a lot of different pieces to think about, but from an athletic perspective, Anthony Richardson is going to go. He's a first round talent from that specific perspective alone. As a thrower, he is not. He's probably more of a third or fourth, maybe even a little higher. He's very raw when it comes to throwing. Inconsistent technique, happy feet, doesn't really know how to set it. But the arm strength is there too. So like you look at a lot of this and you say, okay, arm strength is off the charts. Escapability, mobility, speed, his size, he's able to take hits. You add that with his throwing arm strength, and you have a player, but you have to wonder, can he put the mental aspect? Can he get that down? And if he can, you have a guy. If he can't, he really is the definition of a boom or bust player, like said in the chat. I think he has the highest ceiling of any quarterback in this draft because of who he is as an athlete. But can he put it all together? Can he develop? And, the answer is I don't know. CJ off the board, no one buying athletes first Mugaleta clients here. Cal won't allow it. I would say I think it's a little overblown, at least in my mind. You might be right. There might be Deshaun Watson hangover that is happening at NRG between Cal and maybe even Nick. I think Nick, though, I think Nick's very business is business. I don't think he takes anything personal. He doesn't strike me as a guy that's going to be petty or he's going to have a grudge against David Mugaleta and athletes first. Cal, I don't know, maybe. But I can tell you right now, if that's the approach and they're never going to have a athletes first player on the roster right now, Kaimi is the only one that is on the roster that's an athletes first. You're going to find yourself in a position where you're going to be missing out on talent because you don't want to deal with their agent. at the end of the day, the way I see the David athletes first situation and the Texans relationship is David's client wanted out. David's client had a lot of off-field issues come up, sexual assault allegations. Obviously, the Texans would have loved to have kept Deshaun, but given what happened, I believe they were ready to move on too. They came to a conclusion, and an agreement. They figured that out. David, as an agent, likely made 10% of that $230 million fully guaranteed contract because he gets a portion of it. I don't know the percentage, so I'm just going to throw 10% out there. So he made what, $23 million? That's a lot of money. So I don't know. I think it's a little overblown. But I can understand the concept and the thought behind it because, once you're burned, do you want to be burned again, right? Like George Bush says, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on you. But we'll see how that goes. I like CJ Stroud enough to take him. I like him over Bryce just because of size. I also like what he did against Georgia. I think that Georgia tape is going to probably push him as the number one quarterback. But we'll have to wait and see how that goes. Maybe. All right. What else? I think Nick will be fine. Not sure Cal will swallow a DM client. Okay. Not just quarterback. I think it's probably going to be Bryce or Stroud for number 2 pick. The urgency on this year. Yeah, maybe. Like I said, the Stroud aspect of David Mugoleta and stuff like that is interesting. But we'll just kind of have to wait and see. All right. Well, with that being said, I did a full hour. Kind of surprised that I was able to do that. I'll probably maybe I'll try to do this every morning. I have time for sure. So if you guys want to do it every morning, hit the like and subscribe button, leave a comment. I have time in the morning to do it, so I don't see a reason not to. We'll definitely get back into the swing of things with me and John, recording weekly. Maybe I'll do a daily thing. Why not? In the process of getting the whole room set up to have a better streaming setup and more visually appealing for you guys. And let's see that. Let's hope that this Texans front office gets the head coaching candidate that they want. Let's hope they get the right one, and then let's kind of move on from there. But with that being said, I'm Youngarigold, signing off with Texans Unfiltered. I'll catch you guys tomorrow morning.